Your city, your stories. Celebrating the people and places that make Houston shine. It's Great Day Houston.
And later, we open the tap on the history of beer making from ancient Middle Eastern cultures to medieval times and all the wonderful microbreweries we have right here in town. Next, today it's intentional, but the first beer probably came about as an accident. We love a good beer happy hour, but historically it was also consumed during bad times like a tainted water source, or you didn't have food and beer provided some form of nutrition and calories. A deep dive into the history of making beer from the Sumerians, fermented beverages thousands of years ago, to the craft IPAs and lagers we enjoy at modern craft breweries and grocery store shelves today. This week we just celebrated National Homebrew Day, so we decided to explore the history of making one of the world's most popular beverages. Here to top off the perfect pints from the past, from early days thousands of years ago to the resurgence of beer crafting within the last decade, celebrity historian Raffi Andonian.
Here I am.
Raffi. All right, what we say?
Too.
Yeah. Cheers. Yeah. There you go. Okay, and. Okay, some people might say, okay, beer at 9-something in the morning.
That's
but
right, and I haven't even had breakfast yet, so.
There was a time when if they had to have water, it was beer instead because the water wasn't good.
That's right.
When we say historian, you look at the history of absolutely everything. That's just kind of how your mind works, though. So how did something get to this point?
That's right. I mean, to me, it's fascinating to see the development of how and why we have what we have around us, whether it's social or whether it's something like this, a product like beer. But the beer does tie to the social, as you point out. It does tell a story about people of the past.
Yeah, all right. So how did this whole thing about fixating on history start for you? Probably as you were that curious kid, weren't you?
I was curious, and I have curiosity in many different topics. But history to me, because everything has a history, as you point out, then what happened is history was kind of the weaving thread, if you will, throughout my many curiosities. So I love beer. So I like the history of beer.
You love beer. You actually you had a beer tracker at one point.
That's right. I did have a beer tracker. I kept almost 1,000 beers, and then eventually, I just quit because it just got so burdensome to constantly record all my beers. So I know I'm well past 1,000 different types of beer, but I just stopped recording at some point because I just said, you know what? I just want to enjoy my beer. I don't want to record it every single time.
Yeah. All right. Beer and brewing, the history started,
thousands of years ago. That's right. And like many things, we trace it back to at least ancient Mesopotamia. And in ancient Mesopotamia, you have these various drinks for fermenting of grains, and we might see as sort of the predecessor to beer. You might even argue, the fermentation of honey, which is how you get, different lambics or meads, is something that you can consider the origins of beer, which you see in ancient China as well. But I think the way that we think of beer really are going to see in medieval Europe. Now, it's interesting because it begins to get value along the way. So, for example, ancient Egypt, it was not uncommon to pay laborers in beer, for example.
Okay.
But
these kinds
of
not uncommon
things,
today sometimes.
That's true. That's not a bad form of payment for me. But really, how we think of beer is in the medieval era, is what I would say, for a few different reasons. So, for example, you have monks, and monks were often, of course, fasting, and when they're fasting, then they're going to use beer to help fill them up, and that's when they get the kind of frizziness that we associate with beer, that frosty thing, that texture, and that helps you kind of fill up a little bit more. And so that begins to look like the beers that we know today. Now, in England, you have a lot of use of ales, which is something that comes over, of course, across the Atlantic. And you have eventually the addition of hops, which was initially looked down upon. It was really more a malted beverage, but eventually you get the addition of hops. Today, of course, we cherish adding a lot of hops in beer, especially if you're a hop head.
Yeah, if you're a hop, I wouldn't know. I just taste and I go, okay, that's good. All right, that's awesome. All right, so beer became popular. Of course, it came across the ocean,
across the Atlantic,
in early America. Yep. So you and I think the last time you were on, we talked about the importance of coffee houses, where lots of things happened at coffee houses. Political discussions, the whole bit. That was in the morning. By afternoon, it was happy hour.
Now beer has politics as similar to coffee houses too. So, for example, in the American Revolution, you have this turning against anything that's English. So, kind of like they moved from tea to coffee. We've talked about in the past. It's similar actually with beer. beer because there's a couple of things going on. Number one, in the colonial period, as you point out, water, sometimes you're going to question its security, so beer was pretty common. It was also seen as an alternative to more heavy drinks like gin, which was common in England. In America, you had rum and whiskey, which were very common. So after the American Revolution, however, because beer was associated with England, there was actually a turning away from beer and away from rum, which was coming from the sugar colonies of England.
There was a
That's right,
tea party,
and turning
actually,
away
a famous
from
tea party about
That's right.
that. Yeah.
And so it's kind of a political statement. And then eventually to focus on whiskey. So for example, why is bourbon created here in the United States? Because we're experimenting with whiskey in that early 19th century period as we're trying to move away from beer. But that wasn't entirely what was going on, because there's also the beginnings of a temperance movement, which eventually 100 years later ends up culminating with Prohibition.
Right.
And temperance said, we don't like that liquor stuff. Beer is actually better because liquor can wreck homes because it's too strong.
So I always thought it was like Prohibition was just everything, but they were kind of okay with beer.
And they were exactly, they were favoring, at least at that point in time. But what's interesting about it, Dr. Benjamin Rush actually wrote a paper about this. Benjamin Rush is a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And Thomas Jefferson actually initially, before the Revolution's twist, was looking into creating a national brewery because he thought beer was better than liquor because they were worried about the effects of liquor. This is an era in which there was a lot
drinking
around elections.
We've talked about that in the past, one election where they had
serving rum.
Didn't they have to almost nullify the election because everybody got drunk or something?
Right.
It was like, wait, okay, let's start over.
That's right. There's a lot of drinking at voting booths and candidates serving liquor. So there is a concern over liquor as well.
Yeah.
So there's kind of
why there's a law
forces.
today that you can't have
That's
alcohol.
Right. That's why you have those laws. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's kind of why you have these kind of competing forces in that early 19th century. You have the focus on whiskey, but some of the leaders are like, maybe we shouldn't. And so by the time you get German immigration in the middle 19th century is when beer experiences a revival in the 1840s, 50s, 1860s, when your beer explodes again, more the lager type, the more German type here in the United States.
Yeah, all right. And then so beer never goes away, right? And then, but I just remember when I was growing up, there were like a few options for beer. It was like, it was in a can and a few options, and that was it. I didn't really realize until more recent times how seasonal beer can be, how intentional the flavors can be, until we started having these things called microbreweries.
That's right.
And so here in Houston, one that we know, St. Arnold's, is interesting. Brock Wagner's been on the show before. He was brewing in his dorm room at Rice University, and then he went into banking. But he thought, but my passion is it's a good thing he went into banking because he opened a business, so you could always rely on a business degree. Yeah, but yeah, he said, I finally decided I'm going to open a microbrewery.
That's right. And when I would say about here in Texas, it does start with that German immigration in the mid 19th century that I mentioned that brought beer back into favor. You have Shiner, which of course is part of that wave. You have Lone Star, which actually was started in part by Adolphus Busch, who started Anheuser-Busch, which is in St. Louis. So there were connections between Texas and St. Louis here. And so Lone Star being the oldest brewery in Texas. And so it gives you an idea that German immigration is experienced here in Texas, creating of small breweries. And eventually in the 1970s, 80s, there was consolidation. But in the recent years, as you point out, there's a proliferation of microbrews again. And here we have an array of them from right here in Texas. Now, Shiner is one of the largest craft breweries in the United States now. So Texas has a big contribution to the craft beer scene nationally.
Yeah, all right. And then there's that thing where it's not just a beer. There's like, you go to a bar and go, hey, I'll have a beer. It's like, what kind? Like, you want an IPA, you want a lager, you want a, I have no idea.
More than ever, there's a whole variety, and each of those has its own different story, whether it's the lager, the ale, the porter, which was an English attempt to combine different kinds of beer that were malted into one style. So all of them have their particular story and had different favors at different points. But of course today, with like we said, the proliferation of microbrews, there's actually more than ever before, more types of beer available at your fingertips than ever in the history of the world.
You know,
that's right.
Like wines
exactly.
That's right. But it's crazy because I'm like, when I was sitting there, I go, okay, what? They're like, well, what do you like? I go, I just asked for a beer. They're like, well, we've got a chocolate beer.
That's right.
We have a coffee beer. We have strawberry. We have
levels of hoppiness.
Levels. We have a hoppy beer, but the level 5 hop beer.
Dark, light.
All of that type of stuff, and you're going to get different flavors and a whole bit. But when I mentioned seasonal earlier, there's some things that they are in line. If it's strawberry season, they may have a strawberry.
That's
one
right.
then, right?
And that's that's not uncommon historically speaking either. So historically, in the ancient world, you would have different kinds of spices in each of the different beers. So you might have ginger, you might have oregano, you might even have carrots and cheese thrown into that. Even fruit you can have thrown in there.
Yeah.
So historically, adding different flavors to beer is a thing. So today when we do the seasonality of adding different flavors, it feels new and fresh, but really we're harkening back thousands of years.
Yeah, yeah. All right. When they roll around to October, guess what they have? A pumpkin spice beer.
That's right, exactly.
All right, Raffi, thank you so much. This is a guy that I want sitting next to me on a long plane flight, right? Because it'll pass by like that. For more fun, historical facts, links to some of our favorite Houston breweries, or to learn more about Raffi Andonian, visit greatdayhouston.com. We'll be right back. All right, before we go, we oftentimes, when we go away to a commercial, we have like a continuing conversation. So we were talking about the fact, I was telling Raffi, I have several friends who have said, well, I don't like beer, I only do champagne, all right? I'm like, well, if you don't like beer, chances are you just haven't tasted the right beer yet. You can go to these bubbles instead. And that's part of the process, isn't it?
It is, and it's much like anything else. It's an acquired taste, like wine, for example. So the way I would do this is I would start with the right kind of beer. I think the best beer to start with is a Pilsner, because that's easier and smoother
That's
to start
ones,
on.
right?
It's a lighter lager. It's a very light lager type of beer. And then I would build up from there. Some of the mistakes I see people make is they start with an IPA, because IPAs are popular now, so then they start with it because it's popular. That's too advanced. You have to start with something like a Pilsner, then a general lager, and then maybe a wheat beer after that, and then a regular pale ale after that, and then maybe you can go to like a brown ale, which is a little hoppier, it tends to be, and then maybe an IPA. So I would go in that progression, starting light and easy, so you don't get doused with too strong of a flavor too soon.
Yeah, yeah. And then also a really, really cold beer, or sometimes a little more room temperature beer.
I like it closer to room temperature because I can taste more of the flavor. I think coldness takes away some of the flavor, but if you're new to it, I might start cold so it's not as intense on the tongue, but I personally like it cool but not cold.
Yeah, all right. Tap or can?
Can.
Or bottle? Yeah.
I used to be a bottle person. I got converted to can because it's more airtight is what I understand. And there's something about when you pop the can, it fizzes a little more. I like a little bit of head.
Ah, all right. Well, guess what, Raffi? This happy hour is over. Have a great day, everybody.